All right, hello everyone. I'm Ashley Bischoff. Also with me moderating is Johnny James, and of course our speaker of the day, Jon Gibbins. How are you doing, John?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Hi, thanks for having me.
Fantastic, my pleasure. So you were saying that it's already getting dark in your part of the world?
Yeah, so I'm over in the UK, and I was just getting my computer set up and sat myself down in my living room, and everything started to get dark. So I've just gone and got my bedside lamp from upstairs to make sure you can actually see me. But yeah, it's started to get dark already, which is a bit strange. We've had a lovely day here until this afternoon. Just started to rain, and now it's just really cloudy. So it's like 7 o'clock here. But this is strange for it to be getting so dark so early. But yeah.
Yikes. Well, I don't want to keep up any more of your time from your talk. So just to quickly introduce you, our speaker is Jon Gibbins, and he's a technical director and accessibility whiz at Dig Inclusion, and he's been working with accessibility stuff since 2003. And with that, it's over to you, John.
Hi, thanks. Well, let's see if we can get this this screen share up and running. But just wanted to say thanks to Paciella Group for having me and inviting me to talk today. Let's see, get screen sharing up and running, and see how this goes. Can you guys see the first slide? Okay.
Yep, looking good.
Hopefully this is all good. Okay, great. I'll start. Okay, cool. Well, I hope you guys have been having fun watching ID24 today. I've managed to watch a couple of the talks, but I've been on daddy duty for the day, so I haven't been able to see a lot of it, but I've been seeing lots of things going around on Twitter. So yeah, hope you enjoy my talk anyway. So I'm going to be talking about accessible UX today, and going beyond the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And there are some things in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that cover kind of user experience and usability kind of things. And I wanted to sort of explore beyond what the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and version 2 currently sort of advise, based on some of the things that I've seen in my testing over the years, but also in having a play with screen readers and doing a bit of experimentation. You guys, anybody's been following my blog, I haven't blogged anything in many a year, but I used to have a lab on my website where I used to have test cases for different things that screen readers do, and found some interesting things that they do sometimes. And that kind of inspired me to do a little bit about that as well. So some of the stuff that we see on websites that when we're testing, some of the things that screen readers say can be quite funny sometimes, when they can. It's not always apparent for somebody who is building a website, even following the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, to know exactly how what they're doing affects the end user experience. That only comes with having experience yourself. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. So accessible UX. Let's do a bit of an introduction around what is accessible UX and where Web Content Accessibility Guidelines meets UX, and then we'll go a bit beyond and see what else is happening outside of the guidelines. So, my slide's gone off the right hand side a little bit, but accessibility cannot be done by one person alone in your team. This is one of the problems with UX at the moment, is that you may have an accessibility champion in your team, and it's fantastic that happens. But don't just be the accessibility guy or gal. Raise awareness, because it's not the responsibility of one person to be implementing accessibility. It's more than that. And hopefully we're watching today because we want to make a commitment to making accessible websites. And so by raising awareness and teaching others and continuing to learn for yourself as well, you're helping to ingrain accessibility into your process, which is partly another problem, that the QA stage and testing phase of projects usually comes too late for accessibility concerns. I'm currently doing some work with a client where they've not done some things early enough, so what's happened is they've ended up with a UI that is reliant on some data from the back end, and the data back on the back end is being used to inform some of the UI, and they're intertwined. So when something goes wrong that doesn't quite work on the front end, it's not as simple as just making the change on the front end. It's not always as simple as that. Sometimes it has impact on other systems or the system as a whole when you're talking about web applications. And if they thought about accessibility a little earlier on, then they could have avoided this problem rather than having to ship their product with a known issue. So thinking about accessibility as early as possible and baking it into your process is another problem that, or is another thing that we really need to start trying to do to improve accessibility on the web. So a third problem is, as I mentioned, that accessibility isn't built into the development process. So what can you do? So there's a standard in the UK called VS 8878, and this is not a set of development guidelines. It's a roadmap for ensuring that web products, websites and apps are built in an accessible way, and it gives you some pointers for implementing accessibility as part of your process. Okay. So this is controversial. I don't have all the answers. My clients may come to me and pay me to have the answers, but the fact is that accessibility is contextual to your project, and there's no better person to implement accessibility in your product than you, or no better people than your team. So accessibility comes with experience. You do need to have gotten experience of accessibility and implementing accessibility and knowing how things work to be able to implement it fully. But accessibility is not just about code. There are things beyond code that that come into play. So just because you add something that is accessible to a website, it doesn't mean that it will make sense. This is a photo I've taken from a train here in the UK, and for those who can't see it, there is some buttons for going in and out of a toilet or a restroom, and the sign next to these buttons have Braille on the signs, and actually the labels for the buttons themselves, which have arrows pointing down, have Braille on them as well. One of the things here, that there's a light that says the door is locked. So the information telling you the state of the door, if you like, is a light. So they've thought about accessibility and added the Braille, but they haven't thought about how you're going to tell users that the door is locked, or which button to press. And even the position of the labeling isn't great, because somebody who's reliant on Braille, or who's reading the Braille label, can't figure out easily which button the label is labeling. So just the point that it's not always as straightforward as making it something, adding some accessible code, for example, to a website. And hopefully this helps drive home the point that the design stage is important for establishing the context and making sense of the answers before they become problems. So there's a little bit of a delay between me pressing for the next slide and the next slide coming up, so hopefully this is not causing too much of a problem for people who are watching. So The UX process, this is kind of a rough definition of the user experience design process, and I'm going to talk a bit about how to incorporate accessibility at different stages. So just to give you a summary, you might do some research, find out some information about your users and what kind of things your competitors are doing for your product or website and that kind of thing, and define some goals for the project, and define some different, like you might do some information architecture work, that kind of thing, leading on to some wireframing and iterative testing with real people. So I'm going to go through each of these steps of the process and talk about how you can incorporate accessibility into those different stages. So think about accessibility early, as we've said. The very fact that you're thinking about accessibility, thinking about people, is at an early stage when you're thinking of a typical modern UX process and a user-centered design approach. Accessibility is far more likely to get baked into your prototypes and persist through development, not get lost on the way, and then make it into production at an acceptable level. So putting people first goes a long way towards accessibility, and include people with disabilities for diverse personas in early stages of design. People with different disabilities, different needs, older people, and plan to test with similar people later on down the line as you're developing your product. There's some resources around this on the W3C's website, and there's some recent videos that have been put up that's well worth looking at, and AbilityNet have some examples of personas that they use on their website. So if you're looking for information on that, go check those resources out. So defining things, building an information architecture. Plan understandable structure and plan your heading structure in advance. I've got some slides in a moment that sort of show this in works. I'll post some links later on Twitter when I've finished to some of these resources I'm talking about, and I have some links at the end of the talk, by the way, to some of these resources. Somebody just asked a question around that, so I'd say that now. So, what kind of things do we tend to define? What kind of things would help with accessibility? Hopefully the slide's going to go. Slide's going to move. Or not. Okay, here we go. It's gone forward a few slides. Sorry, it's just catching up with me. Okay, labeling. We know from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, if we've used them before, that it requires concise, clear, consistent and descriptive labels for things. And that goes for form controls, for your navigation items, and for link text in general. But these things help everybody, not just people with disabilities. Design with accessibility in mind. So multimodal interactions. These kind of things I think of as if you're building something that has a hover behavior on the website, then think about how somebody might interact with that using the keyboard and using focus events or focus styles. Also things around different multimedia interactions. So if somebody can't see a video, how are they going to access the content? And think about like transcripts and audio description and those kind of things. And how are those things going to get built into your media player, for example? And think about those things early. Familiarity goes a long way in UX, but it also goes a long way towards accessibility and helping people to understand content, but also understand where they are, orientation within a website, and how to get to where they're wanting to go. And layout and content order is always important. The content order has particular, well, layout and content order have particular impact on somebody who's using the keyboard or somebody who is reliant on a screen reader. Again, from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, contrast and having 4.5 to 1 at least in the WCAG AA standards. When you're designing your color schemes, do your proposed primary colors when you're using them for your content and for your text, are the color combinations going to work? We've come up against in our work a couple of clients who have brand colors that don't quite work for white text on green or white text on blue, just because of the certain hints or tints that are being used. So have a think about those things early. How are those things going to impact the design? And a higher contrast ratio for mobile is required. So we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Color combinations, helping people who have color blindness issues to access content. What kind of things do we need to look at there? And not using color as the only means to convey information on a page. We know these things from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. WebAIM have a fantastic resource for designers on pull together all the things to consider when designing your websites or applications. So be sure to go and take a look at that. So wireframing. Wireframe with accessibility in mind. You can fix accessibility before your product even hits screens. For example, content order. Documenting accessibility as you go will help with your future iterations. So make that part of your standard practice. Annotate your wireframes with accessibility details. You're probably doing some of this already, but you can do things like particularly highlight the structure of a page to help understand what kind of semantics might be in there. And adding headings at appropriate places really helps people with cognitive disabilities, but also people who are using a screen reader for aiding navigation. So how can we do this? Here's just a couple of examples that I mocked up. This is an iPhone app that has, say, a news area on it, and you can label the content order and define the primary areas of different of the screen. And if this was a web page, you'd be thinking about where you'd be putting your nav element, or your main element, or your header element for the page. On the right, we have another mock-up, a sketch of a news page. Where are the headings going to be? What might the page title or the screen title be? Those kind of things are important. You can even go to the extent of, if you have imagery on the page, how is that going to get conveyed to assistive technology users? So this thing that we're getting used to for responsive websites or even apps, the hamburger menu, how is that going to get conveyed to people with disabilities? So when you get to testing, what can you do? So make sure you incorporate people with disabilities in your wireframe and design reviews. If you have a prototype, make sure that you test with people that have disabilities. If you, as I said earlier, if you've added people with disabilities into your set of personas, you'll be doing this anyway, hopefully. And when you're doing practical user testing, what kind of things might a person with a disability require out of the physical premises where you're doing user testing? Is remote testing possible? Be prepared for the test sessions to take longer than usual. As if somebody finds an issue with your site, it might take longer for them to find a solution. It might take longer for them to understand the content. Is the lab itself, that if you're having a physical premises for your tests, is that accessible? So we've already talked a little bit about where the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines can help in the UX process, but what specific things are there? I'm not going to dwell too long on these slides, because these are kind of things that you might have seen before, or other people today have been talking about, but there are things that you can, there are plenty of articles out there on the web that you can go and take a look at to find out more about this. So, information and relationships is part of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Sometimes adding semantics is just not enough. For example, did you know that adding the M tag or strong tag doesn't necessarily get pronounced differently to other body text in your screen readers? It's not by default anyway. You can interrogate find out more about a particular element and find out whether it's got a strong emphasis or not. But a screen reader talking normally will not put additional emphasis on something that has an emphasis or a strong emphasis tag. So you can't rely on them for very important information. That's not to say you should not use them. It's just that if you're using them to, say, highlight a piece of text or a paragraph or a short piece of text, would that be better as a heading? Could it be supplemented with some iconography that you could put an alternative text on to provide context to that information? Those kind of things you don't know unless you've used a screen reader or understand what kind of barriers people with disabilities face. Use of structure helps with context, as I just said. An overview of the page. So if you're adding headings, you can give somebody who's using a screen reader an idea of all the content that's on the page just by having the list of headings, and to quickly navigate to the area of the page that they're interested in. It also helps to break up content so it's more digestible for everybody to understand and read, or read and understand. Markup. What kind of markup do we add? We add headings. We add landmarks to a screen or a page. The use of lists is helpful. Moving on, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines mentions having specifying the language for the page, or specifying where language changes. And oddly, this is such a simple thing to add, but it's oddly something that is quite often missing from web pages. So what kind of things happen if you don't add this? So say you have sur le pont Avignon. What happens if a screen reader tries to read that in English? You probably end up with sur le pont d'Avignon. It doesn't quite have the same ring to it. It doesn't quite have the same je ne sais quoi. So what happens if we add the French language tag to it? It will say that the speech engine in the screen reader will switch to French mode, and it will know how to pronounce those words, hopefully. It doesn't always get things right. But I think words like cliché are quite interesting if you don't have the correct correct accent on the E, or if you don't specify the language. You'll end up with klitsch, or something like that, or something very akin to quiche sometimes gets announced. So those kind of things can be really important for helping with understanding the content, because something that's quite quiche doesn't really make sense. Something that's quite cliche does. So moving on again, instruction and orientation, informative label text, informative heading text, not just the fact that we have labels and have headings, but does the text make sense? And informative error messages. So often error messages get left towards when you actually end up implementing something, and the error message 5, 6, 9, 7, something went wrong doesn't help users. So think about your users early on and what kind of errors might they run into, and what's a human readable and understandable way to convey what's going on and what to do about it. Images of text. Well, we know about alternative text. Images of text are just not flexible, but why is it a problem? So the text in images cannot be selected, and you cannot use this text with speech selection functions. For example, on iOS, a friend of mine is dyslexic, and he will select a phrase or a word that he's not quite sure about and have iOS VoiceOver speak just that bit to him. He isn't a screen reader user, but he is sighted and wants to understand this text, and it's just easier for him to understand it through the audio than it is through reading it. So that can't be done with an image. And the content itself, there are AAA Web Content Accessibility Guidelines success criteria that cover the reading level and the content, but very often we're looking at AA when we're building websites as a good target. But let's not forget about the AAA requirements. Use of plain language wherever possible, unnecessary use of jargon and slang, the line length, justified text, all these things I struggle with. I don't have dyslexia or any other kind of disability of that type, but I find that when somebody has thought about the reading level and thought about how to make their point in plain English, really helps me understand the content. So let's look a bit beyond Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Hopefully I haven't missed something that's actually part of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines in going through these things. This is a brand new talk, so hopefully I won't embarrass myself, but let's see what happens. So when we're thinking about design, sans serif fonts can be, it's much easier in body text for people who are dyslexic to read, for example. It doesn't mean you can't use serif fonts in different places. It's just that they do tend to be easier for people to read. If you do insist on having serif fonts as body text, then offer users a way to override that. And in fact, very often dyslexic users will automatically set their own font that they want to use for a website. So be aware that if you're using something like icon fonts, that those will get overridden for people who are dyslexic. I learned that on Monday from London Web Standards, something I hadn't thought about before, and is an important point to make. That supplementing content with imagery and iconography can really help some users. Don't overdo it because it can be distracting, but where appropriate, adding iconography to things like the menu system can be really helpful for signposting for people who have learning difficulties, for example, or even people who are reading content in a second language. But the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines don't really cover this, so what else can we look at? So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines can mostly be applied to mobile applications. At the moment, it's a little bit missing some things. It wasn't written when touchscreen devices in mind. But to be completely fair to the W3C, the Mobile Accessibility Task Force are on it, and they're making changes, and that you can check out some of the working drafts that are out there and see what kind of things are going to be in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines soon. And there was a talk earlier as well about that, so make sure you check that out on ID24 when you're looking back over the videos. But when designing for touch, make sure that the size of navigation items are at least 7mm. Now, I say 7mm because different screens have different screen resolutions. So it's the ability for the end of your fingertip to hit the item that you're wanting to hit on the screen. If you remember when the iPhone first came out, that websites that weren't built to be responsive, and you would end up with a navigation that you'd have to use pinch zoom, incidentally an assistive technology that's suddenly become useful to everybody. This is one of the reasons I love mobile. There's so many parallels. But you have to zoom in, and you would still sometimes mash your finger on the wrong link and end up somewhere you didn't want to go to. And these things need to be kept in mind now when building applications. Don't use really small buttons. And to be fair, most apps and the most responsive websites are already aware of this. but it's an important thing to remember, and it's not actually a requirement yet under the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Reachability, being able to reach up to the top of your screen with your primary jabber, your thumb, that can have it can be an issue for some people. So Zoom tools, we experience this all the time, everybody, with a website where you're trying to fill in on your smartphone. It doesn't happen so much, of course, on tablet devices, but if you're trying to fill in on a smartphone and you tap in a field and it zooms up to show you the field and have the software keyboard appear, if the label is off to the left, you won't necessarily be able to see what you're filling in. If the label's above what you're filling in, great. It's so much more easier for people to read. Actually, it helps in general for like just on websites as you're normally browsing to make the connection. You don't have to have this big bit of white space between what you're filling out and the label for it. Just makes sense. But again, that positioning isn't quite advised in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So a higher contrast ratio to what's specified in level AA of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And if you're using your mobile phone out and about, and you might have glare from being just out in the sun, and it's not as easy to see what's on the screen. So actually having a higher contrast ratio can really help with that. Of course, we can move our phone to be able to get a better view of what's happening. But the BBC guidelines suggest that the AAA requirement of 7:1 is more appropriate for mobile. Now, whether or not that's actually feasible for designs on mobile for designers to implement is another question. But it's important to test whether your design is actually usable out on mobile devices in the practical environment that they're going to be used in. So, content itself. We've already talked a bit about content and what kind of things that you can do to make things more accessible, but good accessibility very often begins with the content. So, I've decided that I'm not going to go through a talk without including a picture of some classic rock or metal band somewhere, and KISS says it all. And is there a place where KISS does not apply? Keep it simple, stupid. Simplicity is a good place to start when you're looking at making something accessible in general, but also in terms of your content. I'm quite guilty of brain dumping for a blog post and then having to come back and strip out everything that's unnecessary, boil it right down to the main points, and then post it up on the web. Not that I do that a lot on my own site at the moment, if anybody's ever been looking at dotjay.co.uk lately. But your writing style, what kind of things can you do? So make your point clear first and then explain it. By front-loading your paragraphs with the main point, you can help people who have dementia, for example. Helping people who are having to navigate through a large amount of text to be able to find the bit of information they're looking for. Somebody using a screen reader, for example. Or somebody who's reading with English as a second language. Something that a lot of people don't realize is that somebody who is deaf will potentially have English as their second language. Sign language is actually their first language. So understanding the content is actually harder for somebody who's deaf. Try to make one point per paragraph. Again, this is about chunking down the information and making it digestible. Using short line lengths, we kind of touched on this earlier, but the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, I think AAA suggests a length of something around 80 characters. I've seen elsewhere recommendations of somewhere around 7 to 10 words per line, and so it's worth thinking about that. Don't keep them too short, for example, but because it makes them harder to read in a style like, say, in a newspaper, that kind of thing. There's also some useful information around that is actually on the W3C website on COGA, who are the Cognitive and Learning Disabilities Task Force, Accessibility Task Force, and they've got a working draft of information around writing style and what can help. So that's a good resource to go and check out. Caps. It's long been said that by typing in caps you make screen readers shout at people. And apparently it still does happen sometimes, but it does cause other issues as well. So writing in all caps can be much harder for people who with dyslexia to read the content. We actually analyze the shape of words, and by having all caps, you lose that additional sense of the word and to be able to aid with reading the words. So caps, it makes content harder for people with dyslexia to read. But also, it does have an impact on how screen readers, for example, pronounce things. So words like NASA, if you make it capitalized, then it may say NASA rather than NASA, which we don't really refer to NASA as NASA. Perhaps you do, but this isn't a major problem, but it's worth bearing in mind that the capitalization of your words can have an impact on how screen readers pronounce things. Which brings me to some of the funnier side of things with content and testing with accessibility tools. I won't tell you what some of the phrasing and pronunciations I've heard over the time, because they're not suitable for all times of day. So be sure to go and take a look at online, see what kind of thing. We'll try things out for yourself and see what happens. But well, using semantic markup helps and goes a long way to helping make sure that things are announced in the way that it's expected. Screen readers can still get things wrong just by how it analyzes the word or the phrase to pronounce it. We have language selection requirements as part of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but what about that pronunciation? So I have some example, just one example here, and actually it's a mobile example, and to show you how the differences between iOS, Android, and Windows Mobile. So VoiceOver, TalkBack, and I guess you can call it narrator on Windows Mobile, says the word e-newsletter, and I've used the hyphenated version of e-newsletter and non-hyphenated. And on iOS, for example, the e-newsletter without hyphen actually sounds quite Russian and says e-newsletter. And but if you put the hyphen in, or put the dash in, it is pronounced as you would expect, e-newsletter. Android does something a little bit different. It says e-newsletter if you use all one word, but it says it correctly if you use a hyphen in it. Windows Mobile is actually pretty good and says the correct thing either way. But I'm making a point that compound words do cause problems sometimes for screen readers, and this is not required as part of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Compound words are commonplace. We use them day to day. We have, I don't know, on the web we have bookmark, or well, we have that in reading books in real life. Website, that kind of thing. In real life, we grandfather or newspaper and weekend. You know, they're all similar, all compound words. But like homepage will get pronounced in some cases as homopage, and sitemap as sitemip. Sign up in voice over iOS sometimes gets pronounced as signup. So spaces and hyphens are important. Just been informed I'm running low on time, so I'm going to sort of run through just a few more slides, and then we'll come to some questions. But the word reading gets pronounced as either reading or reading, depending on whether you capitalize the R or whether it's part of a heading sometimes. So the context causes the problem. You may have heard this one before. The emphasis is sometimes incorrect. So the pronunciation of skip to content versus skip to main content does make a huge difference, but that's why you see skip to main content sometimes. Ambiguity around dates sometimes. Here's a couple of things that happen. So 0103 could be the 1st of March or the 3rd of January, depending on whether you're in America or not. How does a screen reader work that out? Is the language specified correct? I've seen the number 2013 in a date being pronounced by VoiceOver on iOS as 2013 inches. Who knows why? Or mm in a date format being pronounced as millimeters. Phone numbers are equally something that don't always get read out correctly, or company numbers. But there are things that you can do to improve on it. There's CSS3 has speak as property, or there's also you can add span elements to try and break up the numbers so they're read correctly. Anyway, moving forward, more testing to be done in this area, but I've got some pronunciation tests on my website. But whose responsibility is it? Is it users, software vendors, developers, content creators, web standards? It's actually all of our responsibility to implement accessibility. And just some final thoughts. Test, test, test. The word no, the one word sentence, is read by VoiceOver on iPad correctly. No. On iPhone, it reads it as number. Go figure. But you wouldn't know that unless you test. All of these changes, I hope I've helped you to realize help everybody. So I'm going to miss off my last few slides, but basically I wanted to talk about empathy. Most of us have a connection to accessibility somewhere, and if you think that you don't, just the fact that you might have a mobile phone, as I mentioned through the talk, you might have a relationship to accessibility that you didn't realize you had. Most of us are aging. I would hope all of us are aging. So it does impact our life. And accessibility is about understanding people and the barriers that they face. So getting your own experience of accessibility helps you to put yourself in the shoes of others and keep accessibility in mind when you're building and testing your websites. So one final point is, if you're going to do accessibility, commit. Establish an ongoing commitment to accessibility, create an accessibility statement, and get an accessibility champion on your team. The remaining of my slides are just resources, really, so I'll make sure that you can download them towards the end, and at the end of the talk I'll upload them and you can check those out for yourself. So I'm going to hand back to Ashley, and as soon as I figure out how, and we'll take some questions.
That was great, John. Thank you very much for that. We've got a couple of questions from the audience, and just as a reminder to the audience, if you have questions for John, you can tweet those to the ID24 hashtag, and we'll get to as many as we can. Just the first one here, do you have any thoughts on whether it's more appropriate to use unordered versus ordered lists for navigation lists?
One of the differences in some screen readers versus others is that an ordered list will tell you how many items are in the list as you're going through it. Sometimes an unordered list it will too. But I tend to use unordered lists for navigation. That's the fact that you're using a list is it's helpful to use to know that there are you're on one of 10 list items. As I say, it doesn't. I don't think it works in all screen readers, but I think that an ordered list doesn't make sense for navigation because what order is it in? So semantically speaking, it doesn't really make sense. So I use UL rather than OL, despite the fact that I don't think it announces how many items there are in every screen reader.
Okay, great. And our next question, do you have any rules of thumb about which acronyms screen readers will read letter by letter and which will be pronounced as words?
Well, NASA's a one I've seen. I'm trying to think of others. I actually found some in my testing of way back. We tested acronym versus ABBR tags, and in most screen readers at the time, it didn't have an impact on whether something was pronounced as a word, so an acronym, or something was read out letter by letter. But in adding that semantics, you could at least have a hook for your CSS where you could put how something is supposed to be read using CSS3 Speech module, and hopefully in the future there would be better support for that for CSS3, and it will make a difference. But as far as I'm aware, I haven't done any testing recently on it. It won't have much of an impact. Screen reader speech, or the speech engine that screen reader is using, will be responsible for figuring out how to pronounce something. So yeah, I can't think of others off the top of my head, but it's all down to the testing.
Okay, and our next question, can you talk a bit about the support level for the CSS3 speech in assistive technologies, whether it's non-zero, or is there any news there?
Sure, I can. I did some research quite some time ago. Again, the results are on my lab, but at the time, and this is going back some time, the support was practically zero. However, having said that, I know that there's support coming for like EPUBs. You can went to CSS3 in EPUBs and have, say, VoiceOver on iOS take heed of that. And I know that VoiceOver has some level of support for specifically Speak As, I think it is. As I said, I haven't done testing with it recently, so I'm not entirely sure what the current levels of support are. But at the time when I did the testing, it was practically zero. So it was a chicken or egg situation. I think it's important to follow standards and to implement these things if the tools are there to use them. Whether or not they have support, and the fact that something like an acronym versus ABBR tag, and adding CSS for those two things, so they say that what should be the correct thing. It's an addition of, say, 6 lines of code to a CSS file. So why not do it? It's not a lot of extra work. So my advice is to use those properties as you see fit to. But in testing, you may well see that it makes no difference whatsoever, unfortunately.
Good to know. We also have a question from the audience who is asking whether there may be a link to your slides, or if those might be online by chance.
Yes, there will be. I actually did this talk on Monday for the first time at London Web Standards. And so there is a version of this talk up online already at SlideShare. I hope you find my username on SlideShare. It's my most recent talk. But I'll upload the slides from this one as well, because I've updated a bit with some additional bits that I've found over the last few days. So I'll upload them again to SlideShare, and I'll tweet them. Find me on Twitter as dotjay, and I'm sure ID24 will retweet them. But yeah, the slide will be available after.
Great. And I think we may have time for one more question. They ask, what process do you recommend for ensuring that touch targets are large enough, that is larger than the 7 millimeters? Does it come down to using a ruler on one screen, or do you recommend making those millimeter measurements in the design stage? You can figure out what kind of pixel, depending on what pixel density you're using on, say, on an Android device, depending on the issue with Android being there's so many different screen resolutions to use. With iOS, it's a little bit easier to sort out. You can figure out how many pixels should be, and the Apple OS, Apple Human Interface Guidelines suggest 44 pixels. So if you're talking in pixels, it's easy to put that into practice, yeah, figuring out what's correct for your particular screen resolution you're currently designing for. I would not necessarily get out a ruler and make sure that it's exactly 7 millimeters, but just test it. And can you actually tap everything with your finger? Another consideration is that somebody may be using a touchscreen device but not using their finger.
somebody may, I know there's some people that were affected by thalidomide, have growth of limbs. They may be interacting with an iPad using a stick held by their toes. Those kind of things. The accuracy with which you need to hit things becomes in there. So, is there an opportunity to increase or decrease the size of those targets? Not so easy to do in an app, but perhaps in a web page that's possible. But bear in mind that it's not always just about whether you can match it with your finger, but actually the bigger the target, the better, as far as your design or layout will accommodate without it looking really strange. But really small things do affect some people with different disabilities. So just avoid really small, basically. It's my advice.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jon, for your talk and for sticking around to answer questions. I thought that was wonderful. I think I might just pass it over to Johnny to offer a quick promotion about what's coming up next for ID24.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jon. That was excellent. Yeah, really enjoyed it.
Great. Thanks.
So up next we have the Viking and the Lumberjack. For an hour, they're going to be interviewing Judy Brewer from W3C. So stay tuned for that in about 10 minutes. And yeah, keep tweeting hashtag ID24, and we will see you soon. Thanks very much, everyone.
Great. Thanks for joining us.